Good day. I will be giving you a brief overview of the United Nations Minnesota Protocol on the investigation of potentially unlawful death. This is the gold standard that is used worldwide to investigate suspicious killings, unnatural killings, and this is the document that is used to establish whether such a killing was in fact a murder, a homicide, extrajudicial execution, or whether an enforced disappearance has taken place. The Minnesota Protocol is a legal document, but it's also a forensic document. It brings in legal principles, but also the practices of medical doctors who've worked with these issues over many years. And it also sets out the best practices. It is used by police officers, those who go to the scene of death. It is used by the investigators. It is used by the forensic, the ballistic investigators, prosecutors, and also tribunals, courts, for example, or commissions of inquiry that are established to determine whether there was accountability for a particular death. So one can think of it as a whole chain. From the scene of death to the eventual tribunal, many different people from different professions and from different backgrounds are involved, from the government, also families, NGOs, loved ones, many others are involved. And the Minnesota Protocol describes all the rules that are applicable from the beginning to the end. And of course, as with any chain, it's only as strong as its weakest link. So the Minnesota Protocol then emphasizes that all these different parts have to work together to ensure that if there had been an unlawful death, that eventually there will be proper accountability. So the Minnesota Protocol is the international community's answer to the question, what is a proper investigation into potentially unlawful death? It's a 90-page document. It sets out the law. It provides graphs that can be used in identification of body parts, for example. It has been translated into all the UN languages and into many other languages. It is available online as well. So where does it come from? Well, in the 1980s, in Latin America and other parts of the world, there were extrajudicial executions, there were disappearances, and the question was, how should this then be evaluated? A number of NGOs got together working with the Special Rapporteur on executions and so forth, and they started developing a response to this. One particular individual who was from Minnesota was with Amnesty International in London, and he then asked and wrote back to the doctors at home and asked, please give us an overview of how you investigate potentially unlawful death in your practice. And based on this, they started developing this document. So in 1989, principles on the investigation of extrajudicial execution were drafted, and this was presented to ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council of the UN, and eventually to the General Assembly, and that set out the basic principles. But that had to be implemented and had to be given a concrete meaning. And so again, working with doctors and others, a group of experts developed then the 91 Minnesota Protocol on the investigation of potentially unlawful death. So that was the original document. And this is the document that then was updated again some 25 years later into the current version of the Minnesota Protocol. So one of the questions then is, why did we think that it was necessary to update the Minnesota Protocol of 1991? So a number of things have happened in the meantime. DNA testing became possible, digital photography became available, so technology developed, but also the original Minnesota Protocol just started out the process, and it didn't really focus much on the law. So it had the medical part, but as far as the law is concerned, it essentially focused on commissions of inquiry, which is an important mechanism, but it's by no means the only one or the most prevalent one that is used when unnatural death had occurred. So as Special Rapporteur on Executions at the time, I visited many countries, India, Mexico and others. And it became clear to me that this document must be updated, and we must also find a way to ensure that this document is applicable and that it can be used in full in countries that have resources and countries that have problems with resources. So where does one actually pitch it? Many new good practices have developed in the meantime, and so that's why we decided then, and starting to work in 2013, with a group of medical experts and a group of legal experts to update the Minnesota Protocol. So in 2016, the new Minnesota Protocol was released by the United Nations, and it now serves as the equivalent of the Istanbul Protocol, which applies to torture, while the Minnesota Protocol applies to unlawful killing. So a number of issues had to be addressed in drafting this new Minnesota Protocol. The first was the name itself. Does one use the name Minnesota Protocol again, like it was done with the 91 document? We felt that the name Minnesota had become quite well known. It was a brand, and so we kept that name. Protocol, yes, protocol from a legal point of view means a binding new treaty. But in medical terms, protocol is a medical procedure, and it has established itself in that way. And for that reason, we kept the name Minnesota Protocol, which also then is the equivalent of the Istanbul Protocol. Another issue was, do we address minimum standards, good practice, or simply try to set out the law? I think the overall approach was to say we address the law, but also good practice. And where does one pitch it then? Is it minimum standards or is it maximum standards? So it's a combination of it. So for example, in paragraph 60, we know that not in all countries that fully protective gear is always available. So we say when somebody goes to inspect a body, that person must have suitable gear, and as a minimum, it must include gloves and masks. And then, of course, if possible, additional protective gear as well. Does it apply in peacetime only or in armed conflict? It would be strange if such a protocol only applies in peacetime, and in principle we recognize that it applies in armed conflict as well. What about the prevalence given to commissions of inquiry in the original Minnesota Protocol? I think it's today widely accepted that in addition to commissions of inquiry, other forms of accountability mechanisms are used, and so the new one doesn't have the same emphasis on commissions of inquiry. So when is the duty to investigate triggered? According to the Minnesota Protocol, if a state knew or should have known about a potentially unlawful death, they have to investigate. Of course, if there's a complaint, that triggers the obligation. But even if they do not get a complaint, but they know that this may have happened, they have to investigate. So the scope of the right, it applies to situations where the state or its agents caused the death, to all such instances. It also applies to deaths in custody. So in all cases where people die in custody, there is a presumption that the state is responsible, and it then has to show that it was not responsible. And in the third place, the scope of the right also applies to cases where the state may have breached its obligation to protect somebody. So for example, a public figure may have been threatened and the state fails to try to take reasonable precautions, or there's a demonstration and it's clear that the demonstrators will be attacked and the state can prevent it and it doesn't. So that also falls within the scope. And also all cases where a particular death is unlawful in terms of the domestic law of the state in question. So once a investigation is triggered, the need for an investigation arises, it falls within the scope. Then there are certain elements that the investigation must have, certain standards with which it must comply. It must be prompt, it must also be effective and thorough, it must be independent and it must be impartial, and it must also be transparent. The Minnesota Protocol also contains additional guidance on how investigations should be conducted, and it sets it out in some detail. It says that there must be a strategy for the investigation. It talks about the way in which the crime scene must be managed, how witnesses should be interviewed, the recovery of dead bodies and the management of evidence, how an autopsy must be performed, the ethics that apply, and how the family members should be dealt with. So the Minnesota Protocol, to conclude, is a soft law instrument, but it's the most authoritative document that we have worldwide on how investigations should properly be conducted. As such, it is a central element, a central pillar of the protection of the right to life and the protection of the value that we attach to human life. I thank you.